Okay, so today's book is Tales of Troy and Greece by Andrew Lang. This is a book I found in the library at my school. You can see it's labeled here as Wordsworth Classics. It's a retelling of Greek myths. The first section, consisting of 14 chapters, is called Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities, which is a retelling of the Trojan War story, largely focused on retelling the Iliad and the post-Homerica. Second section is the Wanderings of Ulysses, which is a retelling of the Odyssey. The next is, those are the two main sections actually. Then there are three shorter stories at the end. The Fleece of Gold, which is a retelling of Jason and the Golden Fleece, Theseus, and Perseus. It's a retelling of ancient Greek myths. And it struck me as a little bit strange when I saw this in the library labeled as a classic, because essentially it's just a retelling of other classics. But I thought about it, and I thought, every year new retellings of Greek mythology come out, right? Every time you go into the bookstore, you can see some new author who's retelling the Greek myths. Most of them do not surpass the test of time. A few of them do, and so the ones that do may be legitimately labeled classics. Because even though they're just retellings of other classics, the Iliad, the post-Homerica, the Odyssey, they can become old enough to become classics in their own right, perhaps. The odd thing about this book, as a classic, usually you expect when you pick up like a classic edition to have some sort of introduction or information about the author. And there was just nothing here. I would have appreciated more of an introduction from the publishers to help me appreciate why this is a classic. So without any information from the publishers, I went to the next best thing, the internet, and attempted to look this book up. And there are several reviews of this book, but there's very little information about this book, or at least that I could find. For example, there's no Wikipedia page for this book, which begs the question, is it really a classic if there's no Wikipedia page for it? There is a Wikipedia page for the author, though, the author Andrew Lang, who I had never heard of before, but according to Wikipedia, was a Scottish author, lived around the turn of the century, was a Homeric scholar, so a scholar on the Homeric poems, but was most famous in his own day for collecting fairy tales, and had several volumes of fairy tales, which I think, if I remember right, were labeled in books like the Blue Book of Fairy Tales, the Green Book of Fairy Tales, etc. So those books appear to be his legacy, perhaps the Scottish version of the Brothers Grimm. This book was published by him in 1907. If you go to his Wikipedia page, they list this book in his bibliography, although it's not one of his major works apparently, so there's no separate link to an article about this book. So 1907 is decently old. I mean, that was before World War I. And this edition here, I think Wordsworth printed this in 1995. But I did look this up on the internet, and it is still being sold and published nowadays. You can still buy copies on Amazon.com, etc. So it is still in print now. And in my book, I'd say that usually counts as a classic. If something was published before World War I, and it's still in print now, I usually call that a classic. Although, I've got to be honest, I have mixed feelings about the quality of this book, which maybe I'll get into now. So, I don't know. There are some things to recommend this book. When it's good, it can be quite readable. Andrew Lang is obviously a talented writer, And there are sections of this book where, even though I was rereading stories I already knew, I found his retelling and his prose style very pleasant. But then there are just so many mistakes and inconsistencies and incongruities that I thought to myself, should this book really be labeled a classic, or is it just something from the public domain that maybe Wordsworth slapped a classic label on and decided to sell for a cheap buck or something? Yeah, I don't know. It brings up an interesting question of what is a classic, really. I mean, I usually just consider a classic as something that has surpassed the test of time. But I don't know. Andrew Lang was very prolific. If you look at his Wikipedia page and the bibliography, he published several books a year. And I think especially during this period, 1907 when this was written, he was really going at it. But it does bring into question how careful was the composition of each book. And I distinctly got the impression that he was racing against a deadline, that he wasn't proofreading what he read, and that once it was finished, it just got dashed out to the publisher without anybody giving it the once-over to check for any inconsistencies or incongruities. So that is all to the negative, and that can be a bit annoying when you're reading through this book, in spite of the fact that he obviously is a talented author. And when some of the descriptions are very good and very captivating. So yeah, I guess mixed feelings here. I'm probably going to spend most of the time on this book review complaining about all the things I didn't like, but it is worth saying it was on the whole a pleasant read. Something that struck me as a bit odd is the name Ulysses. It's a retelling of Greek myths, but Ulysses is the Latin name. Odysseus is the Greek. And sorry, when I say Greek and Latin here, I mean the English approximates of the original Greek and Latin. In English, we would say Odysseus for our version of the Greek word, and Ulysses for our version of the Latin word. And yeah, it struck me as rather odd because in most of the Greek mythology books I've read, the convention has just been to use the Greek names. So the Greek gods are given by their Greek names, not their Roman names. It's usually Zeus and not Jupiter. I mean, every once in a while it will be Jupiter, but it seems like the convention in English books is to go with the Greek names. At least nowadays. It got me wondering, though, if the conventions have changed over time. Like a couple hundred years ago, was it more common to use the Roman names when talking about Greek mythology in English? I don't know. But nowadays, I think the convention is to use the Greek names. The one exception to this seems to be Hercules. So Hercules is the Latin. The Greek is Heracles. And quite often, at least in my reading experience, when I pick up a book on Greek mythology, usually all the names will be from the Greek except for Hercules. For whatever reason, Hercules is so established in English as Hercules and not Heracles that it's almost always Hercules in modern retellings of Greek mythology. Which brings up the question, why is that? I mean, why is it only Hercules that we say it in the Latin and everything else in the Greek? I don't know. Does anyone know how that came about or how that convention became so firmly established in English? I mean, it strikes me as a bit odd. I could understand if everything was using the Latin names, but why only Hercules using the Latin names and everything else in Greek usually? Now this book, actually, Hercules does make an appearance at a few different points in this book. But he's called by his Greek name Heracles in this book. All the characters are called by their Greek names with the one exception of Ulysses. He's the only character in here who's called by his Latin name. And I thought, why? And I also thought the Greek name Odysseus is more common in English, isn't it? But then I thought, well, I wonder, 125 years ago in England, was it more, has the convention changed? Was it more popular to say Ulysses at that time? Okay, so for whatever reason, the author is calling him Ulysses, even though all the other names are in the Greek. And the first section is Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities. Now that title struck me as a bit odd. Why call him Ulysses, the Sacker of Cities? I mean, you could make the argument, admittedly. So Ulysses was part of the sack of Troy. He wasn't the only one who sacked Troy, but he was part of it. But based on that, you wouldn't call him the sacker of cities, right? You call him Ulysses, one of the sackers of a city, not Ulysses, the sacker of cities. Now, you could also make the argument that the Greeks actually did sack some cities on their way to Troy. This is one of those little details of the Trojan War that often gets overlooked, even in the ancient sources, because it's a bit of a footnote to the story. But they were originally going out, and the ships got blown back by the wind, and they had to regroup, and then they sacked some cities on the way to Troy. But I would argue that detail is kind of so obscure and so few people know about it that it really doesn't make sense to call him Ulysses, the sacker of cities, based on that detail. And what's more, in Andrew Lang's version, he hardly deals with that event at all. He does devote half a sentence to it. He said, and the Greeks also besieged the cities. He doesn't actually mention that they sacked them, but he does bring up the incident briefly. Now, what strikes me a bit odd about this title, in addition to the fact that it doesn't really seem to fit this section, is... in the ancient world, sacking cities was something that was commonly accepted as part of warfare, but to the modern mind, this is an aspect of ancient warfare which really strikes us as repugnant. So if you're a modern author and you want to make these characters sympathetic for your audience, and Andrew Lang does, he goes through a lot of work to make Ulysses as sympathetic as possible, even going so far as to quietly remove some of the sections of the myth which make Ulysses less sympathetic. For example, Ulysses framing Palamedes and engineering his murder, or Ulysses using trickery to get Achilles' armor from Ajax. Those parts are not in this retelling. He's really making Ulysses out to be the ideal hero, but then it's called the sacker of cities. Now, I did look this up, and Ulysses, the sacker of cities, it does actually come from Homer, so it's authentic. There's a section in the Odyssey. You'll remember this if you read the Odyssey, where he's blinded the Cyclops, and he's sailing out in the ship. And he calls out, I want you to know it was me who did it. Ulysses, the sacker of cities. So, it is from Homer, so I guess fair enough. It's authentic maybe, but I don't know. It doesn't strike me as a good title for this section. And the section is about the Trojan War. So Ulysses, the sacker of cities doesn't really seem like the best title to give the section on the Trojan War, especially, I'll come back to that in a moment, but it's not only Ulysses in that section. Interestingly enough, in that internet search I was doing, it turns out that even Homeric scholars are a little bit puzzled as to why Homer gave him that epithet of Ulysses, the sacker of cities, because again, that was not a big part of his mythos. But it does actually come from Homer. Actually, when Andrew Lang retells that same part in his book, he's retelling that exact same scene, He says, yes. So say that it was Ulysses, Laertes' son of Ithaca, the stormer of cities. So he's got the stormer of cities inside the book, but he's got the sacker of cities as the title of that section. And again, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier, where he was just rushing this off for a deadline and nobody proofread it. I think he went for the stormer of cities as a translation here. And then later when he was coming up for the title of the section, he forgot that he had translated Homer one way earlier and labeled it the Sacker of Cities here, because it doesn't make sense to have the title of the Sacker of Cities and then to translate the quote a different way inside the text. Anyways, enough complaining about the title. It's a retelling of the Trojan War, based largely on the Iliad and the post-Homerica, with a couple other things thrown in there as well. And then the Wanderings of Ulysses is next. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to create some continuity between the Trojan War section and the Odyssey section by making Ulysses the main character in both. It doesn't entirely work, though, because Ulysses was not the main character in the Trojan War. The Trojan War was really an ensemble character. I mean, Achilles and Hector dominate it for a section. But, if you look at the whole stretch, there's just so many characters in there. And occasionally, as he's telling the story, he'll say something like, in his narrator's voice, as the narrator, he'll say something like, okay, I can't spend too much time telling you about this next battle because it doesn't have anything to do with Ulysses. And this is Ulysses' story, after all. But despite saying that a couple times, there are not large sections, but there are lots of parts of this which have very little to do with Ulysses. For example, the whole section with Achilles and his quarrel with Agamemnon, and then Patroclus and Hector on the walls of Troy meeting Andromeda for the last time, and Achilles versus Hector, and the duel between Paris and Menelaus is in here as well. There's a lot of stuff here which really Ulysses is not the main character at, and there's a certain awkwardness in always trying to force Ulysses into the forefront, even though having Ulysses as the main character does kind of lead a little bit smoother into the next section on the Odyssey, but it's not necessary. When I was a kid and I was first reading my introduction to the Trojan War, you read the Trojan War as a Trojan War, and then you read the Odyssey as like a spin-off from that. And I was able to hold perfectly in my head the fact that the Trojan War was about one group of characters, and then the Odyssey was just about one of those characters from the Trojan War who's gone off on a separate adventure. And that was not too much to confuse me as a kid. I didn't need the whole Trojan War story to be about Ulysses in order to have a sense of continuity between that and the story of the Odyssey. So that's one complaint. The other complaint, though, is for large sections of this, Andrew Lang is trying to demythologize the Trojan War. And I suspect that this was because this book was published in 1907. So it was only a few decades after, what was his name? Schillmann? Was Schillmann his name? Discovered Troy, the archaeological site of Troy, which indicated that the Trojan War did have some sort of basis in history. And it's interesting to speculate how much of a basis in history the Trojan War had. What was Achilles based on a real person who lived 3,000 years ago? What was there really an incident that was similar to Helen of Troy? You can get into some interesting speculation here, but the time for speculating is in maybe a more scholarly discussion about what might have been true from this myth. If you're going to retell this myth as a story, which is what this is, then don't get into all this stuff where you're trying to talk about the historical accuracy of it. Just tell tell this as a legend, tell this as a myth. In my mind, I was really interested in the story of the Trojan War as a kid. And what fascinated me the most, and what I still like the most about this story, is the scenes where the gods themselves would join in the battles. You know, that scene in the Iliad where Ares, the god of war, is fighting with the Trojans. And then Athena, the goddess, comes to Diomedes, and she says, okay, we're going to take on Ares together. I'll drive the chariot. You throw the spear when I tell you to. And then Aphrodite and Apollo join in the battle. And the gods and mortals fighting together in these epic battles are what, to me, really make the Trojan War worth reading about, instead of just like all these battle scenes, just the epicness of the gods and humans fighting together. And I think when you lose that, you lose a lot of what makes the original story appealing. He's on a kick to get rid of this. He will, quite often, when there's, in the original story, when there's a god or something who intervenes, he will retell the story so that actually there wasn't a god that was intervening, or there was a possible naturalistic explanation. For example, the beginning of the Iliad, you remember the beginning of the Iliad, Apollo was shooting arrows of sickness into the Greek camp. In Andrew Lang's version, he takes that and he said, there was a sickness that was going through the Greek camp. The Greeks thought that maybe it was Apollo shooting sickness in there, but really it was probably just poor sanitation conditions in the camp. And back in those days, they used to blame everything on the gods. And, okay, I mean, to be fair, that is sort of a very plausible explanation if you were going to go on this, if you wanted to demythologize the Trojan War. But why? I mean, nobody believes that the story in the Iliad is in any way historically accurate, even if you took out all the gods and goddesses from it, even if you completely took out all the supernatural parts. Nobody believes that in the story is at all historically accurate. I mean, maybe the story of Achilles might be loosely based on this famous Greek warrior whose exploits got progressively exaggerated more and more over the generations until it arrived at the story we have now. So, you know, maybe it's historical in origin if you go back far enough. But nobody believes those stories about those duels between the different warriors in the Iliad are in any way historical. So why try and treat it like that? And the same way when there's the fighting between Menelaus and Paris. You remember in the original Iliad, Aphrodite goes in and saves Paris. Andrew Lang says Paris somehow disappeared, and the Greeks thought that it was Aphrodite who did it, but who knows? You know, that kind of stuff throughout that section. And then when he gets to the sections, the stories about the gods fighting in the battles with the Greeks and the Trojans, he just omits those completely. And Zeus and the Olympians quarreling up on Olympus over which side to support, that gets omitted completely as well. So it's a very, I mean, yeah, a lot of the best parts get omitted in my opinion, and there's absolutely no reason for it. I don't think there's any purpose in trying to demythologize the Trojan War. It's mythology. If you're going to tell the story, you should tell it as mythology. I do suspect, though, that around the period that this was written, there was a trend to do that. And in fact, I reviewed earlier this year another book, The Golden Fleece, by Robert Graves, which was written, I forget when that was written, I think around the 1940s or 1930s, which was also trying to demythologize the myth. So I think maybe there was that period where it was in vogue, perhaps. But I'm not a fan. Okay, all right. Sorry, a little bit more on this. He's not entirely consistent. There are some references to Achilles' mother, Thetis, the goddess, and there are references a bit to how Thetis was pleading with Zeus. So some of it does survive. The fact that it's inconsistent just bugs me all the more. And then he gets to the Odyssey. Now, if you're familiar with the Odyssey, it's just one fantastical creature after another. So it's impossible to tell a demythologized version of the Odyssey. Well, maybe you could do it if you really wanted to, but it would be pretty ridiculous. So when he gets to the section of the Odyssey, he said, okay, so as Ulysses was sailing home, there was this strong wind which blew him into fairyland. And then all these magical things happened to him in fairyland. So that's the way he tries to get away, or tries to get around the fact that he had been previously telling a demythologized story. And then all of a sudden, okay, now we're in fairyland, so now there are all these gods and goddesses and creatures. And I thought, okay, that's cheating, but at least we're acknowledging that there's some sort of change going on here. But then that just gets dropped. So, Hermes and Athena come down and talk to Ulysses. He meets the Cyclops and Circe and the sea monsters and everything. And then even when he gets back to his home in Ithaca, the Athena is still guiding him through that. So the whole thing about taking out the gods and goddesses is just completely dropped. And then when we get on to the subsequent stories about Jason and the Golden Fleece and Theseus and Perseus, at this point he's not even trying to demythologize them anymore. So a bit of a reversal there. I suspect what happened is this book did not go through any drafting. He was just writing as quickly as he could. He changed his mind apparently a couple of times over the type of story he wanted to write. But because he was in a hurry to dash this off to the printers, he didn't have time to rewrite anything. So the conflict between the inconsistency between the earlier chapters and the later chapters just stands in the final version. That's all supposition on my part, but supposition is all I have to go on because there seems to be very little information about this book on the internet. Or if anybody knows any better, let me know, but I can't find any explanation. Right, so there are also a few inconsistencies with characters here where he gets some stuff confused. For example, there's two, in the original story of the Greek myth, there are two people named Ajax who fought on the Greek side. And the way they're traditionally distinguished is we call them Ajax the Great and Ajax the Lesser. Sometimes they're referred to by their father's name, Ajax son of Telamon or Ajax Oleos. Excuse my mispronunciation. But usually Ajax the Great and Ajax the Lesser. Ajax the Great had a brother named Teucer, who was also not quite as famous as some of the other heroes in the Trojan War, but he pops up. He was in the Iliad and the Post-Homerica, and he was one of the prominent archers on the Greek side. So Andrew Lang really kind of butchers the distinction between those three. He does talk about Teucer at times and Teucer's archery. But then whenever he needs to talk about Teucer and Ajax together, he just says Ajax brother. And he never makes a connection to his readers that Ajax brother and Teucer are the same person. And I don't know why. Again, I think he was just not carefully proofreading what he was reading. Then when he gets to the section of the Greeks returning home, he says that Ajax brother drowned at sea. Which is not true. That's not what happened to Teucer according to the original myth. Teucer actually made it safely home. It was Ajax the Lesser that drowned at sea. So he's apparently confusing Ajax the Lesser with Ajax brother Teucer. But then when it comes up again, it gets retold a few chapters later when Menelaus is talking to Ulysses' son. What was that? Telemachus? He's talking to Telemachus. And he says, Ajax drowned at sea. Not Ajax the Lesser, not Ajax's brother, but